I'm writing this on a super hot day where I'm at. A day in the mid-90s in the Northern Virginia region. A small glimpse of the types of days that will get increasingly frequent in the near future for the region where I'm at, and which have already gotten increasingly frequent in vulnerable areas around the world. In fact, the worst effects of climate change have already been felt around much of the world, from the southwest United States to northern Europe in some instances, and most fiercely in South Asia. During the month of May, Pakistan and India experienced sweltering heat waves that were made worse due to climate change. These heat waves affected the poor, children, and elderly to such an extent that it literally endangered some of their lives. The heat wave also threatened Pakistan with the diminishing of their clean water supplies, causing a risk of crop shortages that could further stress the economy of the country. In an actual sense, then, climate change is undoubtedly here, and it's evident if you've been paying attention. It's also affecting the most vulnerable among us, whether those are the poorest in the developing world or the marginalized population in some of the cities in the US. In New York City, for instance, the discrepancy between the poor and the rich, which tend to be divided by race also, causes poor people to face the effects of heat waves more furiously. Public parks for wealthier residents often are cleaner and provides urban vegetation space when compared to parks in poorer areas. Wealthier residents have access to public libraries that provide more resources and respites from the heat, while poorer residents often only have access to libraries that lack proper cooling. And wealthier residents have ubiquitous access to cooling systems, paired with an ability to leave the city as they please, while poorer residents don't. This inequality of the intensity of effects felt by climate change is a common theme and will be one going forward into a further climate-stressed world. Inadequate access to resources like food, water, and cooling often follow the axes of privileges, where more privileged individuals get rewarded with those resources more readily, while less privileged individuals often have to wait for them. This will undoubtedly be true in a future world changed by climate change also, and it's concerning to say the least, for it will clearly dictate whether a person would have a chance to live a comfortable and fulfilling life, or whether they won't, and often that will fall onto the socio-economic conditions of that person and their identity, one of which will undoubtedly include whether that person is queer or not. Depart is a book by Sim Kern which centers around Noah Mishner, a transgender Jewish man who becomes a refugee after a devastating hurricane wreaks havoc on the city of Houston. As a refugee, he finds refuge in the Dallas Mavericks' arena, finding a small queer community that makes his life as a refugee a bit easier. However, he still fears that his dual identities will put him at risk with certain Texans, and those fears truly take form when he constantly sees the ghost of his great-grandfather, Abe. As the novella continues, Abe's ghost grows more powerful, threatening Noah's free will and the expression of his identities. Kern's book, in a sense, is a book about survival, but also about the intersections between climate change and social justice. It begs the question of what do we do in the face of climate breakdown, while also asking who would we turn to in the face of disaster. LGBT plus individuals are marginalized in large part because they are often otherized and thus demonized on the account of their identity. This makes attacks against them widespread, and in some places around the world causes them to not be able to access the resources they need to basically live. In some cases, their identities are explicitly criminalized to certain extents, as in Texas when talking about transgender youths, and that causes them to essentially stay in the closet for some parts or a majority of their lives, which can cause a whole host of negative effects on the mental health of these individuals. Oftentimes, the narratives surrounding LGBT plus people can serve as justifications for some of that criminalization, and even for instances of violence directed against them. and, in my view, the threat that climate change poses, both because of the environmental effects that it can levy on ecosystems and because of the social changes it might pose because of stresses on certain aspects of everyday life, can exacerbate some of those instances of demonization to a large degree, which necessitates queer liberation to be fought for within the climate movement also. Part 1. How climate change can affect LGBT plus people. The most recent IPCC reports outline how climate change is already affecting weather patterns in areas around the world. For instance, climate change has undoubtedly made the occurrence of extreme weather events all the more likely, and that includes extreme heat events, extreme precipitation events, and more intense droughts and hurricanes. Climate change has also been making human lives more difficult by directly causing changes in access to water resources, as well as increasing acute food insecurity and malnutrition in areas such as Africa. Climate change, thus, is not a mere physical phenomenon, but instead, the effects it produces has been making human lives much worse. And as already been mentioned, it has been affecting marginalized people disproportionately. And that especially includes people who happen to be homeless. Homeless people are prone to face the worst effects of climate change even more harshly than people who can afford homes. This is a fact that's undeniable, and it stems from the simple fact that homeless people won't have adequate shelter to protect them from the occurrences of extreme weather, which heightens their vulnerability to the climate crisis and even causes their lives to be more at risk when compared to the safety they could afford if they had homes. When thinking further and acknowledging the unfortunate trend of homeless people being criminalized, which causes their makeshift communities to be torn down and violently displaced, homeless people would thus have to face the effects of climate change on an individual level, causing the chances of general survival to be all the more nebulous. Homeless people might even face specific consequences to their health also. For instance, a simple lack of air conditioning can exacerbate health problems during extreme heat events. Additionally, exposure to outdoor air pollutants can severely heighten cardiovascular conditions, while the experience of being homeless paired with the experience of loss due to the extremes of climate change can adversely influence mental health. And as I've already mentioned in my video on infrastructural violence, a lot of these negative effects are explicitly brought about by certain policy choices that seek to create a cruel society. A cruel society, mind you, that makes it extremely difficult to provide help to the people who need it, and inherently treats people as pockets of individuals that should only be beholden to themselves, which is, as I like to call, a sort of neoliberalization of society that displaces the marginalized out of livable communities and which climate change will only make worse. The sad reality is that LGBT plus youths are more than double at risk of being homeless in their lives when compared to non-LGBT plus youths, according to a report by Chapman Hall at the University of Chicago. From those, multiracial or black LGBT plus youths are much more likely to face homelessness when compared to white youths. For instance, 1 in 4 black men who identified as LGBT plus reported explicit homelessness, and that was similar in counts across 22 counties when it came to black or multiracial youths, especially those who identified as LGBT plus. Even though homeless youths across the board experienced similar things, LGBT plus youths were much more likely to have faced extreme traumas that included physical harm and self-harm, discrimination within and outside the family, the exchanging of sex for basic needs, and they were also much more likely to have been forced to have sex. When taking the reality of climate change into account and pairing them with these findings, the risk that LGBT plus people can face, especially youths, can be incredibly heightened. One way it can be so is by taking the reality of an increase in natural disasters and extreme weather events into account and understanding how they could cause LGBT plus people to be discriminated against and driven away from necessary and often life-saving care. In fact, in Depart, there's an explicit instance when Noah gets denied access to testosterone when he visits the clinic of the refugee camp that he stays at. There, the doctor he goes to explicitly says, "I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't treat people with your condition. And there's a lot of sick people here who need actual medical care." The discrimination that LGBT plus people, especially transgender people, face in usual medical care can become exacerbated during times of great upheaval, causing their medical needs to be relegated to the background and often explicitly ignored, especially in emergency situations. It's perhaps clear that climate change can drastically cause more of those situations, which in turn can cause queer people to be explicitly discriminated against merely for who they are, and also denied access to shelter, causing their lives to be threatened ever more so. And it could all stem from who's in power during those times of great stress. Because in actual life, there's an explicit instance where a Republican administration, the Trump administration in particular, allowed homeless shelters that received federal money to discriminate against transgender individuals under religious grounds. The Biden administration repealed that order in 2021, but considering the insane vitriol spewed against transgender people by the right, I can imagine another Republican administration reinstating that rule in the future. Instances of the latter actually point to another fear that I have when it comes to how the climate crisis can affect LGBT plus people. This fear is admittedly less academic in nature, for I haven't been able to come across many academic articles outlining it, but it does stem from recent occurrences of outright bigotry against LGBT plus people that has been going on in actual life right now. It's the fear that the climate crisis and the disturbances it can cause to everyday life can embolden the far right to essentially blame others for it. Of course, accusations of the such can seem outright ridiculous to anyone who understands the basic science behind climate change, but we have seen the rise of all sorts of baseless accusations against LGBT plus people in recent months, and it won't surprise me at all if one eco-fascist can raise the prospect of degeneracy being the true cause for climate change that made us feel God's wrath. Degeneracy, of course, will mean everything from the homosexual agenda to the trans agenda and to feminism, giving eco-fascists a narrative that can scapegoat LGBT plus people as a cause for the climate crisis. Of course, this can definitely be my paranoia talking, but eco-fascist violence has been rising in recent years, backed by concerns about the environment that blames everyone from climate refugees to people in the global south to black and brown people in general for environmental degradation. This is also a time when an unprecedented hate campaign has been started against LGBT plus people, driven by fascists, but mainstreamed by conservative politicians. The rise of hateful narratives against LGBT plus people, most notably transgender people, has been so rapid, in fact, that it has caused actual legislation to pass that outright criminalizes transgender use from existing. That narrativization, which the right has spearheaded, has also caused some liberal politicians like Hillary Clinton to disappointingly warn against explicitly fighting for transgender rights, underscoring how successful the hateful narratives against LGBT plus people has been in recent months. And if those narratives are allowed to continue without pushback, especially in a world already stressed by climate change, then it can prove to have disastrous consequences for LGBT plus people that goes beyond legislation, which means that the climate movement can't leave queer people behind. Part 2, Depart, and why the climate movement can't leave queer people behind. When Noah Mishner first enters the Dallas Mavericks' arena as a climate refugee, his apprehension is described to the reader, and it mostly stems from the fact that he's visibly queer. As he narrates, contrasting the queer neighborhood he lived in with the arena, for the last year, he's hardly left Montrose. Now, hundreds of capital T Texans swarm around him. It's an apprehension that causes him to reconsider everything about how he presents his identity, forcing him to decide whether passing is worth it or not, or whether it's safe or not. That longing for safety, essentially the longing to survive the disaster, is what causes his great-grandfather's ghost to communicate with him in the first place. Abe, Noah's grandfather, is the one who basically guides him to safety on multiple occasions near the beginning of the novel. He provides him the knowledge to leave his home before it floods and tells him to leave his car to reach the roof before the storm wipes it out. Abe is also the one who guides him to meet Elena initially, someone who's a transgender Latina woman, and it's her who suggests that they both should stick together during their stay in the arena. As she says to Noah, "Under those lights, I'm not passing, and neither are you, honey. Might as well stick together." Even though Abe guides him to initial safety, there's still a conflict between Noah and him, and that mostly stems from the fact that Abe values survival over anything else, even going as far as to pressure Noah to leave his friends whenever a dire situation comes up. And that tendency that Abe has to leave whenever there's a struggle for survival comes from the fact that he left everything behind to escape Germany before the ramping up of the Holocaust. We are then greeted with the main conflict of the book, a conflict that asks Noah whether he should leave behind everything for his own survival or whether he should help his family to survive with him. We are also greeted with the first thing that truly links Noah to his Jewish identity, which helps to provide him perspective about himself in ways that he never knew how. One thing that Kern does really well in this book is to frame the personal struggle that Noah faces with the struggle that is there for queer people and other minorities in the arena itself. As I've already noted, even though Noah majorly spends his time with a small group of queer people in the arena, there's still the real danger of more fascistic and bigoted elements springing up around him and upending that safety in a single instance. As an example, when the arena props up a makeshift school and daycare for the kids residing in it, the initial bursts of cooperation provided hope for Noah, lending him to see the beautiful camaraderie that can exist between humans of diverse ethnicities, sexualities, and all types of identities. However, that hope quickly gets upended when an older white man brings an AR-15 into the arena, and even though the police manages to de-escalate the situation without harming the man, he still rattles off a string of racist and ethnic slurs, and the slur that Noah had heard shouted at him out of car windows. The man says, "End these F words, I got a right to protect myself." With this, we see a feature of disaster that can prove deadly for minorities, the otherization and dehumanization of them that can cause some people to turn their fear into power by threatening whole-scale destruction to those communities at large. It's similar to the type of things happening today in our lives also, with the dehumanization of LGBT plus people coming from fascistic groups and legislators during the double crises of the pandemic and the economy, causing LGBT plus people to be seen as acceptable scapegoats to galvanize fascists to enact state violence against them. It's the culture war, in a sense, propped up so that there's always a perpetual other that can distract people from asking for actual policy that will help everyone. As Elena says to Noah and Malone when they all hear about the mayor fanning the reactionary flames of the citizens in the book, who all blame people like Noah for the food shortages. After Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, people's racist side came out real quick. The crisis that goes on in the arena, in which gets framed in relation with Noah's personal struggles about his identities, also gets brought up in the context of Abe himself. As a Jewish man, Abe left Germany when the rhetoric against the Jewish people ramped up in the Third Reich, leaving everything and everyone behind, and Abe urges Noah to do the same whenever he can. I already talked about how Abe guided Noah to leave his apartment and car during the onset of the storm, but one thing that I should mention is that Noah also leaves his chosen family behind, unable to provide a rationale for his feeling to flee to them. Noah obviously feels guilty about that, blaming himself for their deaths. As Noah thinks to himself, so Noah stepped out into the rain and gusting darkness, closing the door on his roommates and only family he could still call his own. Only later, lying on a cot in the Dallas Mavericks' basketball arena, does he realize that nothing could be more cowardly than his silence. Noah quite explicitly regrets that silence, hating himself for it, and also hating the way he compares it to his great-grandfather's willingness to leave his family in times of disaster. The cruel thing is, however, Abe's willingness to leave helped his future family literally survive in a new country. At the same time, that willingness to leave also caused that future family to hate Abe, for that willingness also sprang up when his family needed him the most, providing a painful parallel to Noah. It's also inferred that Abe survived the Third Reich by never outwardly showing his Jewish identity or bringing attention to it, causing Noah to painfully consider whether passing is worth it or not. However, Noah's one still aligned with caring for his family and helping them to safety at all costs, which conflicts with Abe's insistence on survival. That fierce insistence sometimes causes Abe to take full control over Noah's body, forcing Noah to run from danger even when he personally doesn't want to. Conversely, every decision that Noah makes against the will of Abe causes Abe to become even more irritated, threatening Noah with a complete loss of control over his own body. This personified conflict is a real conflict that LGBT plus people have to face in real life, especially in situations where there's a real danger against their lives. It's plainly what causes some people to not come out well into their adulthoods, where they're free from the grip of homophobic family, for instance, and able to defend themselves from the dangers brought about by them. Sometimes situations in their adulthood causes them to not come out during that time either because of outright discrimination that they can face from jobs or school, or simply because the community they live in is not safe. I personally know friends who are LGBT plus who have had to hide that part of themselves because of the state or community they're currently in, all ranging from hiding what their sexuality is to hiding their genuine pronouns and gender identity from the people closest to them. These are choices made for safety, and they're extremely difficult to make, but in those circumstances, surviving is all that matters. And when you're actively persecuted, with your identity being used as a crux to label you as a demon or groomer, then surviving is an act of resistance in itself, especially when people want to kill you, which means that no matter what the liberal insistence would be otherwise, people like Abe who rather flee and hide than fight are valid in their longing to survive above anything. On the other hand, however, there is a strength in staying and fighting to display your identity in bold ways, especially when all your life you've been told that it's an aberration. It's the strength of persistence in the face of persecution that allows someone to firmly be who they truly are, with no one being able to take that away from them. It's also that strength that Noah attempts to get for himself, in contrast to Abe's wanting for him to merely survive. There are 3 specific instances in this book that I believe elucidate what Sim Kern wanted to present through it, and which highlight that conflict intensely. The first instance occurs during a Sabbath that Noah attends at a makeshift temple created in the arena. When Noah is struggling with the bigoted comments made against his transgender identity, he asks David, another Jewish man, why the fuck didn't my ancestors just quit? To that, David angrily replies, I would think that you would understand that there are parts of your identity worth fighting for, especially in the face of persecution. This provides us with context with the internal conflict that Noah had been facing for a long time. The conflict of what's the point? Because if there's a chance that his identity will harm him, what benefit does it do to him in the face of disaster? Noah even says so as much with that phrase, contextualizing it to David through his fears of being not a real man. However, by David pushing back on that statement, he's able to provide some perspective of what it means to hold onto your identity through moments of crisis, even in the face of intense bigotry. It's almost a statement that explicitly says, look at me, I am everything that you hate, and nothing that you do can get me to hide my identity anymore. This instance is important because it provides Noah with a growth moment, giving him a rationale to continue on defending and presenting in his identity. It also serves as a strict contrast with what Abe wanted from him, to not stand out, because that was how Abe was able to survive. In fact, Abe implicitly tells Noah that later in the book, when Abe beckons Noah to abandon Elena so that he and Malone could safely stay at another woman's place. Noah narrates, maybe that is what Abe is here to teach him, that the Jews who survived were the ones willing to abandon everything and everyone. However, Noah still disregards Abe, leaving that woman and going back to the shelter with Elena and Malone. And when Noah fails to listen to Abe one last time, telling Abe that he won't leave his friends, we get what this book is about in its entirety. As Noah says to Abe, I won't let my stories be about the people I left behind. That, in a sense, is what Depart is about. The realization that you shouldn't leave your family, chosen or otherwise, and friends behind, regardless of what could be beneficial for your own survival, and regardless of the circumstances. It also means that you can't get rid of an ancestor, as Noah notes, unpleasant as they may be. It's also an explicit plea of holding on to your identity, even when everything goes wrong. It's a plea that ensures that, in the face of crisis, you simply can't disregard who you are, leaving people behind in the process. The book is also a plea for climate action, but climate action that is truly intersectional. By showing how climate change can make life for queer people harder in one specific way, Kern notes the danger that's there during times of climate breakdown. And that points to another thing. We simply can't leave anyone behind, regardless of what that will mean for the betterment of our movements, which, in an absolute sense, is a way for me to say that the climate movement cannot leave queer people behind, regardless of what concessions they can get from conservatives on climate action. Solidarity means that every fight must be firmly intersectional, and that a movement for a better world means that the better world would be better for everyone, and that we can't turn our backs on anyone. As Noah narrates when he departs the arena, but this time with his family in hand, they do not depart empty-handed. There is a shelter they carry between them, built in furtive glances and waiting for Elena to catch up, panting after sprinting past the dumpsters and hands squeezed, crouched in an empty tent, waiting for the laughter of drunken men to dwindle. It's a shelter that includes all of them, and which makes it so that all of them can be safe. And that is what the climate movement should be fighting for also. Conclusion. Depart by Sim Kern is a book that I very much enjoyed, and it was also a book that taught me a lot about myself. I say that because during all the times Abe was telling Noah to leave, I agreed with him, giving me an uncomfortable insight about myself that I didn't want to know. However, as I read on and empathized with Noah, I quickly realized that there was a value in fighting for the people you cared about and making sure their safety was as much guaranteed as yours, which is something that should be known by everyone also, especially the climate movement. In this age of unprecedented attacks against LGBT plus people, we should firmly and without apology know that there's no climate action without queer liberation, and that our fight is an intersectional fight. As climate change wreaks havoc on everyone, but especially LGBT plus people because of the discrimination and outright threats to violence they face, we must demand that we move forward towards a better world with everyone's hands in ours, ensuring that we don't depart without everyone in sight.